This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 89 of Here's How for the 6th of August 2019. The Census is coming back, asking lots of questions. In this podcast, I'm going to turn tables and ask the census takers what they'll be asking us and why.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
Here's what we've got coming up for you in this podcast.
There's lots of different views on the religious question, and CSO and the Census Advisory Group's role is to try and strike a balance. So there were people that didn't want a religion question in the census form.
Wait. Strike a balance between good statistical practice and bad statistical practice?
No, between the various demands that are out there from the user community.
That's coming up shortly. First of all, I want to thank all of my donors on Patreon. I really appreciate them all. In case you don't know, Patreon is basically a system that allows people to donate a couple of dollars per podcast or per month. That helps me to devote more time to finding interesting guests and doing research. You can think of it as some sort of retribution for having to pay €160 a year to RTE for your TV license. If you think you could do the same as those donors, there's details of how to do it on the website and at the end of this show. Let's do a bit of science. Maybe, like me, you've had various social media invaded by people making all sorts of complaints about something called 5G. That's the newest mobile data standard. Unless you're really special, that doesn't work on your phone yet, but the networks are being installed and newer handsets using them will be available soon, probably starting at the top end of the price range. 5G just means fifth generation. The first generation was basic mobile phones. The second was text messaging. 4G allows internet, and 5G will allow you to control the space shuttle, something like that. If you click too far into Facebook or YouTube, you'd be forgiven for thinking that an apocalypse was planned, something between the worst nightmares of the anti-vaxxers and those people who say that their thoughts are controlled by the CIA via a chip in their brain. So I really just want to give the basic scientific information here. 5G is data transmitted over radio waves. Just like any other form of data transmitted through the air, mobile phone, voice or data signals, FM radio, broadcast TV, or your home Wi-Fi. All of them are, technically, radiation. So is light, by which I mean the light that your eyes use to see the things around you, and so are magnetic waves, the ones that spin the needle on the compass. Some conspiracy theorists have been saying vague things that imply that 5G uses some weird special type of radiation that's dangerous or untested. In reality, 5G uses frequencies that are already in use by home Wi-Fi systems and digital TV broadcasts. Sure, the content of that signal is new technology, but the content of the signal has no relevance to the frequency it's broadcast on. So where does that all collide with radiation that we know can kill us? Basically, the electromagnetic spectrum is split in two halves: ionizing radiation and non-ionizing radiation. Non-ionizing radiation is too weak to strip the electrons off atoms, so it doesn't create ions. Ionizing radiation is the dangerous stuff. It can knock electrons off atoms and break molecules like your DNA, which can trigger cancer. all radiation fits on a spectrum, the electromagnetic spectrum, with lower and higher frequencies. Imagine if you could turn the dial on your radio and keep turning it. If you turn down and down, you'd eventually be picking up the Earth's magnetic waves, the ones that turn the compass needle. If you could turn it up and up, you'd eventually pick up light waves, first blue light, then the higher frequency of red light. Turn it a bit further and you'd get UV rays from the sun, then X-rays, and so on. But there is a break point that's important to know about. It exists at a frequency just above what we can see as visible light. Light doesn't hurt us, but UV rays, radiation from the sun, can give us sunburn. This is literally radiation damage. UV rays and anything with a higher frequency, X-rays, gamma rays, they're bad news. That's why anyone giving you an X-ray wears a lead apron. And gamma rays, that's Chernobyl territory. You don't want to know. But, the 5G conspiracy theorists say, there's so much radiation about these days, surely that can't be good for us. They're wrong for two reasons. Firstly, non-ionizing radiation just doesn't have enough energy to do any harm. It almost doesn't matter how much of it there is. Think of ionizing radiation like being burnt by boiling water. A teaspoonful on your skin would hurt. A cupful would be bad. Throw a kettle of it over someone and they're seriously injured. Non-ionizing radiation is the equivalent of lukewarm water. It doesn't matter if it's a cupful, a bathful, or a whole swimming pool full. If it's not hot enough, no amount of it will burn you. Secondly, humans evolved bathed in non-ionizing radiation. It's called light and magnetic waves. As it happens, the radio waves that we use for TV, radio, mobile phones, and 5G are right in the middle of those two, between light and magnetic waves on the electromagnetic spectrum. The strength of the natural magnetic and light waves around us are millions and millions of times stronger than any human-produced radio waves. Magnetic waves coming from the poles of the Earth, thousands of kilometers away, have enough energy to physically move the needle on a compass. Sit out on a sunny day, you can literally feel the sun from millions of kilometers away warming your skin. The strength of even our strongest transmitters is a tiny fraction of either of those. So why are people obsessed with being so worried about these? Not to mention the anti-vaccine hysteria. My advice is not to laugh at people like this. What they say might be wrong, but that is almost a side issue. I think that people who obsess about technology that they don't understand are expressing an unease that they have with modernity, their lives and the world. Patience and listening might help.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? If you want your point of view heard, dial 076 603 5060 and leave a contribution for the show. The lines are open 24/7 and you can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
On a phone line now, I have Cormac Halpin. He's a senior statistician for the CSO, the Central Statistics Office. And Cormac, you're going to talk to me about the census. When is that going to happen and what's going to be new about it?
Well, William, the census is going to take place on the 18th of April 2021. That was decided in a government decision a couple of weeks ago. Also, as part of that government decision, we've had a decision on what content will actually be included in the census questionnaire. So there'll be 8 new questions that will be on the questionnaire. These are in varied areas, so I'll just list them out to you here. There will be renewable energy, smoke alarms, internet access and devices, smoking, volunteering, childcare, working from home, and time of leaving place of work, school or college. So 8 new questions, and there'll also be revisions to 25 existing questions. So quite a lot of change compared to what people would have seen in 2016.
Okay. You mentioned a couple of them there. For example, smoking and volunteering. Always when census comes around, people can be a little bit nervous. Is the government right to be knocking on everybody's door and inquiring with that level of detail into their lives?
Well, the census is held for very good reason. From a top level, the political representation that we have in the country is constitutionally bound by what comes out of the census, and as well as that, member states' EU contributions has also got a basis in the census. There's a vast amount of policy and service delivery across government and the public sector are reliant on census data. So things like the locations of schools, the DESH school status that might be attributed to schools come from the census, public transport planning decisions, healthcare provision. I don't think you'll see a county development plan that doesn't reference census data. So things like roads, parks that are very relevant to people's lives. As well as that, people may not be aware, but it's an EU regulation that every member state is required to hold a census in 2021. So the government
sure, but you're not required to find out whether I do volunteering for the local St Vincent de Paul, are you?
There's actually quite a lot that we are required to find out from the EU. About half the questions on the census form are stipulated by EU regulation that we have to include on the census form. There are some questions that aren't mandatory under EU regulation, but there's a very strong user demand. So CSO doesn't put these questions onto the census form for the good of its health. We have a very detailed consultation process that we've just concluded as part of this, that we put out representation for people to make submissions, both public, interested parties, government bodies and so on, for what they'd like to see on the census form. So that then gets subject to scrutiny by a group called the Census Advisory Group, which is a group of appointed representatives from about 25 to 30 different organisations who are charged with going through all these submissions to assist the CSO in deciding where the real user need is. So there's quite a detailed process. After that happens, then we conduct a census pilot survey, which happened last year. It covered about 10,000 households across 7 different counties to test the statistical viability of these new questions. So between establishing the statistical viability of the questions and the user demand, that really is what drives the decision as to whether the questions can appear on the census form. I also wouldn't underplay, it's something that might seem trite to people, but it's actually a very important consideration, is the actual constraints of space on the form. So as I said, about half the
How many pages?
On the form. Well, there'll be a 24-page form, and there'll be 3 pages per person for the questions. So there's that. There were some people on the advisory group that suggested increasing the number of pages per person, but that of course increases the statistical burden on the public. And there's good international experience to show that the more questions you ask of people, the less quality of the responses you get.
Okay, so, I want to focus on that for a minute. Because you mentioned the Census Advisory Group and that you had done an exercise to see what should be asked and what people wanted to be asked. And I want to look at that in a little bit more detail, but I just want to establish one particular fact first, Cormac, which is, have you stopped beating your wife?
I'm conscious that you asked this question of a colleague of mine before.
I did.
It presupposes that I do beat my wife.
Indeed. But that isn't an option on my box. I've got a yes or a no to take. And which can you take?
Well, what I'd say is that the census is a very blunt instrument. It's really a sledgehammer to crack a walnut. So the degree of nuance that we have available to us in the census is limited. Don't forget that this census form goes into every single household in the country, various degrees of levels of education and levels of literacy. So
sure. Pause for that for a moment. You know that is a malformed question, and you're a senior statistician actually at the CSO. So for everybody who will instinctively know that that's a malformed question, but tell me from the point of view of a statistician why that's a malformed question.
Well, it presupposes information that may or may not be true.
Okay, and that's not the limit of it. You'll know that other statisticians, for example, who do opinion polling, they're well aware that it's quite easy to formulate questions that doesn't necessarily flip everybody, but that will certainly skew the statistical basis of a response really quite remarkably. If you want to get an answer on a particular question, it's possible to prime the responder with the previous questions. And this has been done, I think it was yes minister or yes prime minister, and the civil servant is able to lead the prime minister into saying that they would or would not support conscription into the army.
Well, the party have had an opinion poll done. It seems all the voters are in favour of bringing back national service.
Well, have another opinion poll done showing the voters are against bringing back national service.
We can't be for it and
Oh,
against.
of course they can, Bernard. This nice young lady comes up to you. Obviously you want to create a good impression. You don't want to look a fool, do you?
No.
No, so she starts asking you some questions. Mr. Woolley, are you worried about the number of young people without jobs?
Yes.
Are you worried about the rise in crime among teenagers?
Yes.
Do you think there's a lack of discipline in our comprehensive schools?
Yes.
Do you think young people welcome some authority and leadership in their lives?
Yes.
Do you think they respond to a challenge?
Yes.
Would you be in favour of reintroducing national service?
Yes. Oh, well, I suppose I might.
Yes or no?
Yes.
Of course you would, Bernard. After all you've told you can't say no to that. So, they don't mention the first 5 questions and they publish the last one.
Is that really what they do?
Well, not the reputable ones, no, but there aren't many of those. So, alternatively, the young lady can get the opposite result.
How?
Mr. Woolley, are you worried about the danger of war?
Yes.
Are you worried about the growth of armaments?
Yes.
Do you think there's a danger in giving young people guns and teaching them how to kill?
Yes.
Do you think it's wrong to force people to take up arms against their will?
Yes.
Would you oppose the reintroduction of national service?
Yes.
That's a real issue in the census, isn't it?
Well, I think you're maybe ascribing some intent to CSO that doesn't necessarily exist.
No. What I'm ascribing is that it's important for you to be mindful of that in order to get a neutral result.
Yeah, I mean, CSO in some senses we are very much the owner, but in other senses we're the custodian of the census. That our main interest is to have questions that are statistically viable, from things like, a low level of non-response to the question, evidence that the question has been answered coherently in conjunction with other questions on the census form, and that, having a question on the form won't give rise to confidentiality disclosure issues. So things like that are the things that we really focus on from a statistical perspective. What we appoint a Census Advisory Group is to help us with stuff like user need. Is there demand from the user need out there for policy development, for service provision? And that's not something that the CSO is an expert on, nor should it be, but that's where we convene the Census Advisory Group to help us from that perspective.
Okay. You mentioned that I asked this a few years back of a colleague of yours who was doing your job at the time, I think, and the question I asked, have you stopped beating your wife question, was in relation to religion, and the religion question on the census was phrased as, what is your religion? That's plainly building an assumption into the question, isn't it?
Well, the religion question, like every other question that we put up for consultation, received submissions, and it actually was one of the most commented on questions that we received submissions on. What you've mentioned there, the supposition that there's a religion as part of the question, was certainly something that was touched upon. There's lots of other things touched upon in the religion question. So we had people contacting us saying that there should be no religion question on the census form, which has some validity. Census is really all about small area information. It's not about establishing the high-level proportion of Roman Catholics in the country against people with no religion. Surveys can do that. Census is about being able to drill down to low levels of population.
Okay, if I can go back to the previous census, because I've got the graphic. You haven't produced the one for the next one, but I have the one of the previous one in front of me, and it says, question: what is your religion? And there's various tick boxes. The first tick box is Roman Catholic, which is obviously the largest religion in the country. The second tick box is Church of Ireland, which would be the third largest group in the country, religious group. The third option is Presbyterian, which would be the fourth largest religious group in the country, and then goes on down to Islam and various others. Then it has an option to write in your own religion. And then after all of that, it has a tick box for the second most common religious group in the country, which is people of no religion. If you were a conspiracy theorist, that would really go quite a long way towards convincing you that that was intended to push people towards ticking the box that reflected their cultural affiliation rather than their religious belief, wouldn't it?
So, as I said, every question on the census form is open to public consultation, and as I was saying there's lots of different views on the religious question, and CSO and the Census Advisory Group's role is to try and strike a balance. So there were people that didn't want a religion question on the census form.
Wait. Strike a balance between good statistical practice and bad statistical practice?
No, between the various demands that are out there from the user community. So if you let me finish what I was saying, there are people out there who don't want a religion question in the census form. There are people out there and groups out there who think the religion question that was there in 2016 and 2011 and 2006 is fine and it should be left as is. We have to take that into account. There are people who think that we shouldn't be asking about religion, we should be asking about religious practice. That has to be taken account of as well. There are submissions from professors of theology who will maintain that what we've listed are not religions, they are denominations of Christianity combined with religion, so the question is incoherent. So there's actually quite a lot that we have to try and balance in order to maintain satisfaction amongst our users while maintaining statistical the integrity of the question.
Sure,
so,
but you surely would you surely agree that maintaining statistical integrity is the first priority. After that, clearly you want to collect the information that people want you to collect, but if it's statistically invalid, everything else goes out the window.
Well, there's different ways of measuring statistical validity, but I suppose what my point is that you're not going to keep everybody happy no matter what you do with the religion question, including dropping the religion question.
Absolutely, of course you're not. Of course you're not. But you're a statistician first and foremost. I'm not aware. I don't think you're a minister of religion. Surely your first duty is to make it statistically valid.
Yeah, that is certainly something. So we would have looked at measures of statistical validity, including continuity with previous data, with levels of non-response, with reaction from the public in terms of feedback we would have got. So they certainly feed into our considerations, but it's part of a broader spectrum, including the user demand and the consultation submissions that we received. So I suppose what I'm saying is that there's a lot of balance to be struck for this, and we could have made significant other changes.
Okay, how is it planned that the religion question will be phrased in the coming census?
So we tested two questions in the pilot that I referred to earlier on for religion. The first version of that was, what is your religion, if any? The first response to that was no religion, followed by Roman Catholic, Church of Ireland, Islam, Orthodox Christian, Presbyterian, and then another religion right in box. And then the second one asked, do you have a religion? It asked yes or no with response options, and then if yes, then respondents were provided the opportunity to take the religion that they had. So both of those questions were tested. So we've previously charges have been levelled against the CSO that we wouldn't consider changes to the religion question. So that's clearly not the case this time round. So the options that were presented to the Census Advisory Group when we reconvened,
can I just repeat that for the listeners? So one option that you tested was to say, do you have a religion? Yes, no. If so, what is it? And another option that you tested was, what is your religion, if any?
Correct.
Okay, and which one are you going with?
The first response option to that is no religion. So they were both tested in the pilot. We presented four potential options to the advisory group with what should be done with the religion question in 2021. The first was to drop the religion question, which, as I said previously, there is a case for that as well, whether it's relevant to include it on a census. The second one was to retain the religion question that was there in 2016, which you've previously mentioned. And the third and fourth options were to go one of the pilot finding questions, what is your religion, if any, or do you have a religion, yes, no. There was a discussion in the group, and the consensus that emerged from the group is the first question that I mentioned as part of the pilot. So what is your religion, if any, with no religion being the first response option, will be the one that is included in Census 2021, and that has subsequently been signed off by the government, so it will appear on the form. Okay.
I don't mean to nitpick over this, but you as a statistician will be aware that, for example, if Red C or MRBI or whoever, if they called up people doing a political survey saying, you will vote Fianna Fáil, won't you? They would get a very inaccurate result. So the way that you ask the question, you agree, is very, very important in order to get accurate information.
Of course.
And the one thing that I'm referring to here is a different survey, not done by you. It was done by the Bishops' Conference of the Roman Catholic bishops in Ireland. And they did a survey of people asking what their religion was and where they were Roman Catholic, which is obviously a large proportion. They asked many other questions. The first headline from that was that the bishops got a response that was more or less fitting with the census. So they got roughly the same number of Catholics as you did. So you're doing something, if not right, at least coherent there. But the second thing that they did was they asked a lot of subsequent questions of Catholics about Catholic belief. And, for example, they discovered that a large majority of Catholics don't believe in the devil. A very significant number of Catholics don't believe in heaven, don't believe in the afterlife, and 10% of Catholics don't believe in God. You can see that it's really a little bit difficult to classify that person as a Catholic in the theological sense. It's wildly clear there that those people are answering in cultural terms, not in religious terms. Is there a danger that you're doing the same thing? My question, a bit of a long question, but the question that I'm really asking you is, what information are you capturing when somebody ticks the Catholic or, for example, Church of Ireland or Muslim or whatever box?
Well, I think you hit on it there. It is quite a long question. And as I said previously, we are very constrained in what we can ask in the census. I'm sure there would be people who would like us to be able to ask, following on from the religion question, what do you believe in, what do you not believe in? How many days a week do you go to mass? But unfortunately,
no. I'm asking you. No, I'm asking you something much more basic. What is the information that you're trying to capture?
Well, the use that the religion question uses, but first of all, there's another statistical element to it, is that there's a time series element to it as well. So when you change a question,
change over time,
you're compromising the comparability over time. So
I understand.
That was a consideration as part of that as well. So the religion question has been used in the past to decide on things like the denomination of schools, and also it's been used. Something that came up as part of the discussion, the Census Advisory Group's identification of minority religions, where around the country they are, and there might be a service provision implication for those as well. But apart from that, I think on a broader level, there's the ethno-cultural identification. So between Census 2002 and 2006, when we saw a large degree of immigration from Eastern European countries, we would have seen a spike in religions such as Orthodox Christian, which people coming in from countries like Lithuania and so on. So you can see that getting recorded. So, an aspect of the census is a marker of the country's progress over time. So you see that reflected in the census results. And to me, part of the beauty of looking at census results is seeing received wisdom actually coming out in data. So you would expect, large proportion of people coming from Poland would have Roman Catholic religion, and that's the case when you see it coming through in census results. Similarly, as I said, people with Orthodox Christian beliefs coming from Lithuania and Latvia maybe. So that's an aspect to it as well. So, we would have made the argument to the advisory group, is there a need for this on a census small area level? But the feeling from the group was that there was, and that question that we've discussed is the one that's going to be appearing in 2021.
Sure, I understand, but what I'm looking for is essentially guidance for the listeners. A very, very large chunk of the country are people who are perhaps baptized, who are nominally Catholics, but don't have any belief in the catechism, don't practice Catholicism, don't really have anything other than a cultural, historical link to Catholicism, and probably no link at all to the Catholic Church. What's the correct box for them to take? I genuinely don't know.
Well, we could flip this on its head, and we could propose, or the advisory group could propose a question to say, do you practice a certain religion? And then you could be asking me a question. You could say to me, I go to Mass at Christmas, I go to funerals, I've had my child baptized. Does that mean practicing? I go to Mass X times a year. Is that practicing?
I'm not disputing the difficulty. I'm just wondering what it is that you're capturing.
Well, the guidance that we've issued in the past is that people answer that question in terms of how they feel themselves and their own beliefs, and that's the only guidance that we give in that question, and that's the guidance that we'll be giving again in that question. I would anticipate in 2021 that people are best placed themselves to answer the question, and the data will be analysed from the perspective of the time series over time.
Okay. Want to move on a little bit. We saw in the recent European elections that there were exit polls, which are supposed to be significantly more accurate than pre-election opinion polls because you capture exactly the people who have voted and they've already voted, so there's no room for them to change their mind. And they were significantly inaccurate. There is a danger that people will report what they think they're supposed to report rather than what might actually be true. And I'm looking here at, and we mentioned earlier, the question on volunteering, on smoking, and also on renewable energy sources. Have you taken any steps to minimize what might be called the virtue signaling, where people give the answer that they think is politically correct to give rather than the one that's actually true?
So as part of a full census campaign, unlike the pilot survey that we had last year, we'd have a very big public awareness piece, including lots of information around why questions are on the forum, why they're asked the way that they're asked, what the data will ultimately be used for. And as part of the analysis of the questions prior to going back to the Census Advisory Group, we would have looked at as much coherency information as we could. So, for example, we would have talked to the SEAI with the renewable energy question to get a feel for the incidence of the different types of renewable energy sources around the country to see if the data coming out of the pilot made sense.
So you could benchmark it against a known value?
Yes. And if there was something that was way out of line, that would be a red light straight away that we'd need to get to the bottom of before we could recommend inclusion of the question. So we did the same for the smoking question, the same for the volunteering. There's lots of data, for example, in volunteering from surveys from other bodies and from CSO in the past. So you'd have something to make sure that you weren't way out of kilter. And
were you?
No. The questions were they were pretty close to what had gone before. The smoking one, for example, was benchmarked against the Healthy Ireland survey that's conducted by the Department of Health. And the instance of smoking that we got in the census was remarkably close to what was in the Healthy Ireland survey.
You could all be asking the same wrong question, but hopefully that's not true. One thing that strikes me on that is that it may be possible to make an estimate of the amount of smuggled tobacco being used in Ireland. Is that something that could be done with the degree of information that's available to you, or that will be when you do the census?
It hasn't come up as part of the consultation. I think that the main focus of why the Department of Health and others wanted that question in the Census Forum is due to significant exchequer spend that goes on smoking-related illnesses. It's in the order of billions. And I think their priority was really to be able to target awareness campaigns and to get categorical information. That the pilot, as it does, through lots of information about the relative health levels of people who smoke against people who don't smoke. And again, there's a lot of received wisdom to it in that, people who smoke were generally less healthy than people who do smoke. But it'll give that kind of small area aspect. So we'll get incidents around the country of where people smoke, the Department of Health will, and be able to target their resources and their various processes to ensure that smoking is healthcare spending is targeted where it should be, and reduction efforts in terms of smoking will be targeted as well.
You've mentioned small areas there. Can you just explain what those small areas are for the listeners?
So they're geographical areas that are, there's about 18,500 of them around Ireland, and they consist of approximately 150 to 200 dwellings. So they're neighbourhood level statistics that you can only produce from a census. So they're standard size, as I said, 150 to 200 dwellings. So it'll allow you to compare a small area or our group of small areas in Dublin against a similar cohort of small areas in Kerry, for example. They came about because previously, going back to 2006, the lowest level of geography we had available were electoral divisions, which are defined by statute, but they're actually quite different in size. You could get ones in Dublin that had a huge proportion of population against one in rural Ireland maybe that were larger in geographical area but had very few people living in them. So it's an attempt to get a uniform area of geography for comparison purposes.
And then you can say this particular area with particular characteristics has a much higher level of smoking or has a much lower level of having smoke alarms in their home, and that then allows state agencies to target interventions is the idea, yes?
Yeah, the smoke alarm one is a good example. So we'll be able to see where exactly around the country at a small area level working smoke alarms are. And we saw stuff in the pilot like older buildings in general don't have as many smoke alarms as newer apartments, which again you might expect to see, but the data bore it out. So it'll again allow the relevant bodies and parties to target their awareness campaigns and their policies at those areas.
One last thing. I remember when I was a child, the census form being filled in And I have to say, particularly with use of the Irish language, but with other aspects as well, it was certainly aspirational rather than factual. And now that you are asking things like, for example, smoking, for example, internet access, is there any degree to which the paper form is outdated? And if you could allow particularly older children to perhaps go on their phone and fill in that information, you might get much better quality information. That is a real issue, isn't it? That if the 15 or 16-year-old in the house smokes, what's the likelihood that they're going to tell mom or dad when they're filling in the form?
Yeah, well, there's, as part of our job here, we have lots of contacts with other international census offices, both throughout the EU and with other English-speaking countries. And something that becomes apparent very quickly is that there's no silver bullet. Every way of doing the census has advantages and disadvantages. So you mentioned the online completion piece there, and your listeners may or may not be aware that there's been a couple of recent international instances that show the challenges that are around an internet census. So in Australia in 2016, the internet census site was the subject of a direct denial of service attack, which actually brought the site down for 43 hours. And denied a lot of people the ability to complete the census form, and that actually ended up in a Senate inquiry in Australia, which is not really anywhere any statistician wants to be, and severely dented confidence in the Australian Bureau of Statistics. Only last year, New Zealand had an internet census as well, and the upshot of that was that the response rates that they got fell far below what they had expected because they overly aggressively cut their field force, so there weren't as many people knocking on the doors like we have in Ireland. The upshot of that is they still haven't published any results from it because they're desperately trying to plug holes that arose because of that. And the best case scenario for them is that the results will be delayed for 6 months. So yes, you can criticise Ireland for not having an internet census in 2021, but it's not the be all and end all. And as well as that, there are real issues around cost. To develop an internet census takes resources. It's not something that can be done overnight. There are huge investment decisions around infrastructure, software, testing, additional people, and so on. So there would be a big additional cost impact as well. And there's also an issue around cloud hosting. So if there was to be an internet census, people's personal data would be held in a private cloud, and we're not sure the public would be ready to accept that. So there are good reasons to do an internet census, but there are very good reasons not to do an internet census as well, and that's the decision that we've come to for 2021. But having said that, we're actively reviewing our strategy for 2026 as well and for future censuses.
The word that's coming into my mind is e-voting. You're essentially trying to avoid a fiasco like that, am I right?
Well, we're making a decision with our eyes open. Essentially the output from an internet census will be the same as you get from a paper census. And then you're making a kind of a cost-benefit decision, bearing in mind what's happened internationally in some very comparable countries to ours, whether it's worth putting that investment in. And the decision we've taken this time round is that we're going to retain the paper, but we're keeping an open mind for future censuses.
Cormac Halpin, Senior Statistician for the Central Statistics Office, thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you.
Never miss a show. Follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter and like Here's How on Facebook for updates on each show's contents.
If you'd like to hear more podcasts from me, I'd certainly love to do them, and I could devote more time to them if I got them sponsored. I have a page on Patreon that allows ordinary listeners to donate $1 or $2 per podcast or per month, whatever you want. So if you think it's valuable, please do that and share the podcasts with your friends so they can do the same. Go to the website for sources and references from the show, and while you're there, you can like the show on Facebook, follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter, and get in touch with me if you can suggest a guest or a topic for a future show. Also, you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email. All that, including my Patreon link, are at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. Thank you for listening.